Hi to the LinkedIn audience. My name's Scott Walker. I'm a managing director with Mantle Advisors and Sentinel Resource Group. And I have with me today the one and the only Ray O'Hare. And I'll let Ray, although he doesn't need to be introduced, I will let Ray introduce himself.
Hey, now
Tell
wait
us
a
about
minute. We
yourself.
didn't plan on doing that. So, well, let me follow that up. Hello, everyone, and yes, I appreciate Scott's comments, and we're actually here for you, though. We think very strongly about transitioning from the private sector to the public sector, or vice versa, but mostly from the public to the private. And there's lots of things out there that are interesting today, and we'd like you to know about them. So we have three or four things we're going to cover. And then we'll probably take a break for a week or two and come back and finalize on another topic of social networks and developing your talents on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So Scott, what do you think about our first topic of how do I get started? I want to go
Yeah,
from the LAPD to a CSO. How do I
that's
do
right.
that?
That's right. Well, as Ray knows, and for folks on LinkedIn that don't know, I work probably on a weekly basis with people who are transitioning from the military and from law enforcement to do that successfully. What does that look like, and what kind of considerations should they have on top of my normal duties as a managing director, right? But this is something that both Ray and I are passionate about. Both Ray and I come from a law enforcement background, and what we want to do is set people up for success. And so we get this question constantly, which is how do I start? How do I even get out there and put myself out there? What does the corporate sector look like? And we're going to talk about that. But one of the things that I generally tell folks is to start with understanding where you want to go. Geography plays a big role in how I talk with people that I'm talking through this transition process. And I don't know if that's the same thing for you, Ray, but I find it a real challenge when I have folks that it's usually military veterans or military members that are in. I had one veteran who was overseas in Europe, and he wanted to come back home to Texas, and he was looking for a corporate security job in Texas. But his resume had U.S. military base X in Germany, right? And so to potential employers, it looks like he's a German citizen. He's not an American. They maybe don't even read down past that. So one of the challenges that I have with folks, especially who are geographically different than where they want to go, is, and this I think will play in a little bit to our discussion about how COVID has affected these kinds of challenges. But I think the thing that I run into a lot is first you got to identify where do you want to go. Not so much an issue in COVID world, as we know there's a lot of people working remote, but that's kind of where I start with them, is not so much a focus on their resume or even who they are yet, but because I'll have people who are like, I want to work, I want to be the CSO of a big tech company, but I don't want to move to California. Okay. We gotta do it. There's some discussion we have to have there because that's kind of the tech mecca. I don't know. Have you had a similar experience, right?
Yeah, no, I think I feel for the people because it's a big challenge, and you work and you build a career and you build a reputation in whatever sector you're in, local, federal, or state, and or the military, and now you say, okay, I think I'm going to retire next year. So certainly we want to talk about getting started early and kind of figure out what the guidelines are, what the landscape looks like, and a couple of things that stand out all the time. If you apply for a job today, and no matter what your background is, and if it's a CSO or a high level security role, there's going to be a minimum of 300 to 400 resumes for that job. So when there's 300 to 400 resumes, now you have to get that narrowed down to one or two. So how do you do that?
Right.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And 300 or 400 is actually conservative. And then the second thing about that you have to remember is that you have to file for that job electronically so that the companies can comply with their regulatory issues. But so now your resume is going to be screened electronically. So that means that when they do that, there's a word search And if you don't hit those word search names that they're looking for, you're never going to hear another word about it. And that's a horrible thing, and um, it's very irritating to know that you applied for a job and you never heard another word. So lesson number two, if you apply for a job and you've done all your research, the next thing you have to do is you have to get around that electronic filing. And if you stick with us for a while, you'll hear what we have to say about that as we go forward. So so I think that's kind of a good thumbprint of what maybe they should start thinking about and what have you. And I like what you said about the location, especially as it relates to COVID today. You maybe don't want to go to Boise, Idaho, or
That's right.
maybe you do want to go to
Maybe do.
Boise, Idaho. But I would say, and I would tell everybody that I talk to, don't worry too much about the location of the job today. It's especially as it relates to COVID, as we know in the last year, but even beyond that, there are many people that are not at a company location in the corporate security arena. So while it might say Boise, Idaho or Pocatello, Idaho, don't worry too much about that until later on, and we'll tell you what that might mean later on.
Do you find that there's an expectation that when folks are coming out of, specifically, I find this with law enforcement folks, but they're coming out of a 20 plus, 30 plus year career with one entity, that they expect to land in the Google, Apple, Toyota, Microsoft for the next 20 years? Can you talk a little bit about that? And you have had an amazing career. And so the reason why I bring this up is because not even you stayed in one company for, a ton of time. But maybe this is the longest you've ever been in the company now with AS, but I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, you have to have lofty goals,
Mm.
and there's nothing wrong with that. And being positive about yourself and having a good attitude. And what I find is that we try to realize that the credentials that we have today that we're putting on a piece of paper actually would be attractive to the hiring manager. Now, in some cases, the hiring manager may not necessarily be a security practitioner. It may be somebody else. The recruiter certainly is not a security practitioner, and that is a challenge and that is a hurdle.
Right.
And so I actually talked to a fellow the other day, and a federal retiree who had a great career, great credentials, and he followed that up by doing something in the state that he lived in another 5 years, and he was miffed that he sent a resume to a job that I happened to know about, and no one ever said anything. And he was miffed about that, thinking, how could they ignore my credentials? Well, first of all, I said, maybe no one ever saw your credentials because the
Mm-hmm.
electronic screening screens you out, and that's the end of that. But at the same time, I'll remind again everybody that's watching, the recruiter that's talking with you may not know what FBI stands for, or they
That's
may
right.
not know that a DS State Department employee is actually a real professional security person.
That's right. That's
You
right.
know, you have to just stick with this, and at the end of the day, you have to remember it's not you, it's the process. So you have to think long and hard about that, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about researching where you think you might want to go to work.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important what you're nailing. We'll talk about culture more here soon, but I think identifying the role and the right role for you and the right role for the company, this isn't unlike dating, and it's more about it's you finding a place where you're going to fit in and less about how much money can I make, how much stock can I get, what are the perks of the job, because the likelihood is that you're there to 3 to 5 years if you're a true security leader, and then you're gonna cycle into something else. You're gonna find a bigger, better role. How much does you talked about certification or certifications? How much does that play in 2020 and beyond now. Do you find that's more important to be certified in the industry or to have some type of industry recognition as we kind of as people, there's going to be huge transitions over the next few years with security leaders.
I'm the wrong person to ask about certification because I've been a proponent of certification for way too many years to remember. But I will say this, and I say this a lot today: having a certification in our industry demonstrates your forthrightness in going after something that benefits you. And so then you say, well, which one is that to have today? And I wouldn't really distinguish between too many of them, but if it requires an examination and requires credentials to get that examination, then that's one that you should do. If it's something you send away for and now you have 5 letters after your name, that probably doesn't hold as much weight. And I also say today that if you're considering a certification, you probably should consider something that has to do with cybersecurity
Mm.
as maybe your lead certification, or if you already have a certification and you really think you need another, try to get that one in there, maybe the CISSP, or something along those lines. And that just demonstrates that you've done something later in your career to advance your personal knowledge and skill set. And now you're competing with others that might have 2 or 3 certifications that you don't have any. So give that some thought. And remember, this is not the federal government. This is not the city police department. This is corporate America.
But what do you say, Ray, when somebody tells you, "But I've been through NYPD SWAT school. I know everything there is to know about security." What do
Well,
you get that? What do you say to
I
them?
have I have a pat answer for that. And I say, so Scott, you say that you are the best homicide investigator in the United States of America because you did this and this and this. And I say, Scott, let me just remind you that if there's a homicide in corporate America, they're going to call 911. They're not going to
That's right.
call you.
Nope.
So those skills themselves are not necessarily transferable, but the skills that are transferable are what you've done in your career in managing people, managing a budget, finding goals and meeting those goals and setting strategic initiatives. So don't be offended by that, Scott, because it is
No,
it
I
isn't just about you.
I agree. And especially when it comes to investigators, I usually tell them that they have the requisite skills they learned from detective school, which is you have to identify key constituents or strategic leaders within your organization, and you need to build relationships with them. You're not going to get anything prosecuted if the DA hates you, or doesn't like it. Doesn't they see your search warrant come across their desk and they're like, I'm not going to even put this forward because they know you have a bad reputation. That's going to be the same way in the private sector. And so I think a lot of our folks, me included, when I transitioned about almost 7 years ago, I had a lot of misplaced arrogance about the private sector, that this was easy compared to law
Yeah.
enforcement. And certain days are easier than others, but my understanding of business was zero. It was less than zero compared to where I am today. And that was only because when I figured out really quickly that I had misplaced arrogance, I corrected that and I started listening more than I spoke. And how much do you think business acumen play in transition?
Oh, it's tremendous, and really, if you were a captain in the Marine Corps and you want to get promoted to commander or whatever the next thing is, or if you're in the PD and the same thing, you're a lieutenant and you want to be a captain, you have to research that and prepare for that. So in the corporate America, I'd say a couple of things. If they're a publicly traded company, you can research them till the end of the earth and learn a lot about them. What's their culture? How do they make money? Where are they located around the world? And there's a federal report called the 10K SEC report that talks about what the company's risks are. So, for
For
example,
publicly traded companies, by the way.
correct, only
Yeah.
for a publicly traded company. So, for example, if the organization is a manufacturing company and they have one location in China that's subject to flooding and shutting down and what have you, that product line is at risk.
Okay.
So it would be nice for you to understand that and understand why it's at risk, and then maybe potentially what some of the mitigating issues are. So as you think about that, um, it's hard to understand what the company culture is because you're not an employee. But I'll give you a good example. A friend of mine is in the process of interviewing now, and I think he's on his about 11th or 12th interview, all of which COVID wise are done on a panel on Zoom or
On
something.
Zoom.
So after about 10 or 12 of those, I said, do you really want to work at this company if they're going to spend that much time interviewing you and you're really no further ahead than when you did the first interview? And
Wow.
it's really, it's something to think about. So how you get treated by the interview process, the recruiter and what have you, is as important as your skill set in giving them something that they want from you. And it's really a trade-off. So if you're not treated fairly, don't blow that off. It might not necessarily be the end of it, but remember the recruiter is just a recruiter. The recruiter is not the hiring manager. So you want to get close to the hiring manager, and if you feel uncomfortable or what have you, that's where you could air those thoughts out.
That's great. That's great advice. I'm going to pause us here because there are other topics that we're going to talk about here in the very near future. We're going to talk about corporate culture and how to understand that greater and dive into that some more. We're also going to start talking about social networks and what does that look like? Because obviously a lot of our law enforcement friends don't want to have a social network profile, and how does that play into the transition discussion? But to the folks that are watching this, send us your questions. Send us if you want us to talk about something. I mean, I could go on with Ray. We could do this for the next 2 weeks straight, and you have so much knowledge to impart. But I want others to also tell us what's important to them and what kind of things do they need to talk about. But not only are we going to talk about your social network, we're going to talk about your network and what does that mean. I have the opinion and the framing, and I'm going to ask Ray, and this will be answered in a future kind of posting. But I definitely think we should talk about how that network plays into transition, and I think that the network is so important that more than likely you will get the job coming out of the Marine Corps, coming out of LAPD, coming out of the FBI from somebody who you know, and or somebody who has referred you to somebody else. It'll come through some type of network connection, not shotgunning your resume out there 1,000 times a day. That's not going to be the future, I don't think. But so Ray, let's pause here, and we'll pick this up in the next posting. I want to thank you so much for one, being a mentor to me throughout the many years that I've known you, and look forward to watching your success grow and listening to your wise anecdotes of how folks can transition and do this transition successfully.
Yeah, you know what we need Scott, and I know Scott agrees with me on this, that we don't expect anything in return for helping
Right.
someone. All we expect is that somewhere down the road, whether you're 25 years old and you're just starting, or you're 55 years old and you're looking for your second career, is just to help someone else. And that's the satisfaction that we get for doing this. So we appreciate your time and look forward to hearing from you. And we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks, and be safe out there.
That's right. Thanks, everybody.